The grand hall was draped in white and gold, a picture-perfect setting for the union of Daniel and Grace. The guests were an elegant crowd, sipping champagne under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Amid the festive laughter and clinking glasses, nobody suspected the darkness that simmered just beneath the surface. Daniel's best man, Liam, stood by his side, a polished smile masking his turmoil. Months ago, Liam had crossed an unforgivable line, an affair with Grace. What began as stolen glances and whispered words had spiraled into something neither could fully control. They had ended it, swearing to bury their secret for the sake of the wedding. But the tension lingered like a noose tightening with each passing second. As the ceremony unfolded, Daniel's adoring gaze never left Grace, his hand firm on hers as they exchanged vows. Liam's eyes flickered, betraying guilt and something else, resentment. The man he called his best friend was about to marry the woman Liam couldn't forget. The reception brought a storm of emotions to the surface. Under the guise of a celebratory toast, Liam spoke with a bitterness veiled in humor. His words twisted subtly, painting Grace in shades that only she and Daniel could truly decode. Daniel's brow furrowed, his smile faltering for the first time. It was during the first dance when the cracks finally splintered. Liam approached Grace at the edge of the dance floor, his tone low and urgent. "We need to talk," he hissed. "Not now," Grace whispered back, her eyes darting to Daniel. But Liam's persistence drew them to a secluded hallway, where the illusion of perfection crumbled. "Do you really think you can just walk away from what we had?" Liam's voice was sharp, his body tense. "What we had was a mistake," Grace shot back. "This is Daniel's day. I love him."
Before I continue, my friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but it's a huge boost of motivation for me to keep creating videos. I'd also greatly appreciate your comments. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to the story.
"You want to know the truth, Daniel? She's been lying to you. We were together." The room seemed to contract as Daniel processed the revelation. His fists clenched, his face a storm of betrayal and fury. "Is that true, Grace?" Grace's silence was all the confirmation he needed. What happened next was a blur. The argument escalated into a violent confrontation. Daniel lunged at Liam, his rage untethered. Glass shattered as they collided with a nearby table. The pristine hallway transformed into chaos. Grace screamed for them to stop, but the sound was drowned out by the fray. When the fight finally ended, Daniel stood over Liam, his knuckles bloodied. Liam lay motionless, his head resting at an unnatural angle. A crimson stain spread across the marble floor. The police arrived soon after. The joyous event turned into a crime scene. Daniel was led away in handcuffs, his face blank with shock. Grace was left standing alone, the weight of her choices crashing down upon her. The guests whispered in horror as the bride's pristine white dress became the starkest reminder of the bloodshed that ended what was supposed to be a fairy tale. In the weeks that followed, the scandal consumed everyone connected to the wedding. The media painted vivid, sordid headlines. Asterisk betrayal at the altar. Love triangle ends in tragedy asterisk, feeding on every salacious detail. For Daniel, the whirlwind of police interrogations and court hearings left little time to grieve. He had loved Grace with every fiber of his being, and now that love felt like a dagger buried deep in his chest. From his cell, Daniel replayed the fight over and over in his mind. The betrayal, the rage, the moment he realized Liam wasn't moving. Guilt gnawed at him. Not just for what he'd done to Liam, but for ignoring the subtle signs that something had been wrong between Grace and his best friend all along. Grace, meanwhile, had become a pariah. The townspeople who once admired her were now quick to whisper and point. Some labeled her a temptress, others a victim of circumstance. She avoided the outside world, barricading herself in her apartment. The walls closed in on her as she stared at photos of the life she could have had. She couldn't escape the memory of Liam's lifeless body or the way Daniel's face twisted when he learned the truth. She visited Daniel only once. Sitting across the glass divider in the sterile visitation room, she struggled to find words. His eyes were cold, distant, as if the man she'd once loved had been replaced by a stranger. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice cracked, carrying the weight of her guilt. "I never wanted it to end like this." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. Instead, he simply leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "You didn't just destroy us, Grace. You destroyed me." The silence between them was heavy, broken only when the guard signaled that time was up. Grace left, feeling the hollow ache of knowing she could never undo the damage she had caused. Months turned into years. Daniel's trial was a media spectacle, with lawyers debating whether his actions were a crime of passion or cold-blooded murder. Grace testified reluctantly, her voice trembling as she recounted the events. The courtroom was tense, every word scrutinized. The jury deliberated for hours before returning with their verdict: manslaughter. Daniel was sentenced to 10 years, a punishment lighter than many had expected, but one that left him with a decade to reflect on the events that had shattered his world. As Daniel sat in his prison cell, the noise of the outside world faded. He immersed himself in books, seeking solace in stories of redemption and forgiveness. Yet, forgiveness felt like an elusive dream, something reserved for others, not for a man who had let rage consume him. Grace moved to a distant city, hoping to start anew, but the shadow of her past followed her. Every romantic encounter was tainted by the memory of what she had done. She lived a life of quiet solitude, working at a small bookstore, where she spent her days lost in novels and her nights haunted by the choices that had led to Liam's death. And so, the three lives that had once been entwined in love and friendship were now bound by pain and regret. Time marched on, but the wounds remained, a stark reminder that betrayal and bloodshed could forever change the course of even the most promising lives. Years passed, and the world seemed to move on from the infamous wedding tragedy. But for Daniel, Grace, and the memories of Liam, the past was a wound that refused to heal. Daniel, now 5 years into his sentence, had settled into the monotonous rhythm of prison life. He had gained a reputation among the other inmates as someone to be left alone. His once sharp features had hardened, and the fire in his eyes was replaced with a quiet resignation. Yet, there were moments of clarity in the monotony. Moments when he would replay Grace's words during the trial or hear Liam's laughter in his dreams. One day, Daniel received an unexpected visitor. A young woman, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, sat across from him in the visitation room. Her face was unfamiliar, but her eyes carried a striking resemblance to Liam's. "My name's Anna," she said, her voice steady. "I'm Liam's sister." Daniel's jaw tightened. Memories of Liam's playful grin and easy charm flooded back, but they were now tainted by the rage of that fateful night. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. Anna leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "I need answers. Liam and I weren't close, but I can't stop wondering what really happened. The media made him out to be a villain. Grace painted herself as a victim. And you're the man who killed my brother. I want to hear it from you." Daniel hesitated, his hands clenching into fists on the table. He had avoided speaking about that night for years, but something in Anna's tone, an unflinching blend of anger and curiosity, pushed him to speak. Slowly, he recounted the events, his voice raw and unfiltered. He didn't spare himself from the blame, nor did he paint Liam as a saint. When he finished, Anna sat back, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know if it helps, but at least now I know." After Anna left, Daniel felt an unfamiliar weight lift from his chest. For the first time, he had spoken the truth. Not for a lawyer, a judge, or even Grace, but for someone who deserved to hear it. Grace's life had taken a quieter turn. She had married once, briefly, but the relationship crumbled under the strain of her past. Her days were now spent in solitude, running the small bookstore she owned. One evening, as the shop was about to close, she noticed a familiar figure lingering near the shelves. "Anna." "Your Grace," Anna said, not bothering with pleasantries. Grace nodded, her heart pounding. You know, Anna continued, her voice calm but firm, it's easy to paint yourself as the victim, but you're the one who lit the match that burned everything down. Grace flinched, the words cutting deep. I've paid for my mistakes, she whispered, her voice trembling. Have you? Anna countered, stepping closer. Because my brother paid with his life and Daniel's paying with his freedom. And you? You're still standing. Grace had no response. As Anna turned and walked out, the weight of her words settled over Grace like a shroud. In his final years in prison, Daniel began to write. Letters, journals, fragments of thoughts, all dedicated to processing the pain and betrayal that had consumed him. One letter, however, was different. It was addressed to Grace. He wrote about the life they had dreamed of building together, the love they had shared before it all fell apart. He admitted his own failures but also spoke of the hurt her choices had caused. It was a letter of closure, not forgiveness, but understanding. When Grace received it, she cried for hours, the words pulling her back to a time when love had seemed unbreakable. She wrote back, pouring out her own regrets, her apologies, and her longing for redemption. Though they never saw each other again, their letters continued. They became a lifeline, a way to find some semblance of peace in the wreckage of their lives. By the time Daniel was released, he was a man transformed, older, quieter, and wiser. He left the prison gates with no plans, no destination. He only knew that he would never return to the man he had been before. Grace, too, continued her life, carrying the scars of her choices but finding solace in small, everyday joys. A child's laughter in her bookstore, the comfort of a cup of tea at dusk. And Anna, the woman who had sought answers, walked away with something she hadn't expected. Not closure, but clarity. She had seen the cost of betrayal and anger, and it left her determined to never repeat the mistakes that had destroyed so many lives. In the end, none of them found happiness in the way they once dreamed, but they found a way to survive, to rebuild, and to live with the ghosts of the past. Not as tormentors, but as reminders of what could never be undone. Daniel stood on the other side of the prison gates, the cold winter air biting his skin. His breath came out in visible puffs as he clutched the small duffel bag containing his belongings. The world outside felt alien, too loud, too fast. 10 years had reshaped him, both inside and out. He was no longer the man who had walked into that wedding full of hope. He wasn't sure who he was now. He stayed in a halfway house for a time, working odd jobs and keeping to himself. People still recognized him, though fewer than he expected. Some stared, others whispered. He ignored them. What mattered was finding a way forward. One day he received a letter at the halfway house. The familiar handwriting on the envelope stopped him cold. Grace. He hadn't heard from her in years. Their letters had slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely. Now, as he opened the envelope, he felt the weight of their shared past pressing down on him. The letter was brief. Daniel, I heard you're out. I don't know if you want to hear from me, but I wanted to say this. I hope you're finding your peace. I know it's not something we can ever truly have, but I've tried to find small ways to make amends. There's a place near the lake where we once talked about the future. I've left something there for you. Grace. The lake. The memory came back to him with a painful sharpness. The place where they'd once dreamed of building a cabin, of starting a family. Felt like another lifetime. He debated for days, but curiosity and something deeper, a lingering connection, drew him there. When he arrived, the lake was frozen over, its surface a mirror reflecting the pale winter sky. On the shore, beneath an old oak tree, he found a small wooden box. Inside was a collection of photographs, images from the years he had been gone. Grace standing in her bookstore, a soft smile on her face. A sunrise over a quiet street. A bench by the river. Each photo seemed to say, I'm still here. I'm still trying. Tucked beneath the photos was a final letter. Daniel, I've spent so many years haunted by what I did to you, to Liam, to all of us. I thought for a long time that I didn't deserve happiness, and maybe I still don't. But I realized that punishing myself wouldn't bring him back or undo the pain. So I've tried to live a life that matters, even if it's small and quiet. I wanted to show you that life goes on, even when it feels impossible. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I don't expect it. But I hope, in some small way, these moments can remind you that you deserve to live again. 2. Grace. Daniel folded the letter carefully and sat by the lake for hours. The sun set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, but he didn't move. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, not out of anger or regret, but for the weight of it all. For the love that had been lost, for the man he had been, and for the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way forward. In the months that followed, Daniel took steps toward rebuilding his life. He found a job at a small mechanic's shop, working with his hands in a way that felt grounding. He avoided the town where it all happened, choosing instead to settle in a quiet village where he was just another face in the crowd. Grace never heard from him again, but she didn't expect to. Her letter had been her way of letting go. Still, she often found herself wondering where he was, whether he'd found the peace they had both been chasing. Anna, too, found her place in the story's aftermath. She became a social worker, dedicating herself to helping others navigate the kind of pain her family had endured. In her own way, she carried the memory of Liam forward, ensuring that his life, however flawed, wasn't defined solely by its tragic end. The scars left by that fateful wedding day never fully healed for any of them. But in the silence that followed, they each found a way to carry on. Life wasn't perfect, and the weight of the past never truly disappeared. But it grew lighter with time, replaced by the understanding that survival itself was a kind of victory. And so, their lives continued, fractured, imperfect, but still moving forward. Each of them carried the echoes of the choices they had made, the love they had lost, and the lessons they had learned. The ghosts of the past lingered, but they no longer haunted. Instead, they whispered reminders of how far they had come. Years turned to decades, and the echoes of the wedding day's tragedy softened, though they never fully disappeared. The lives of Daniel, Grace, and Anna continued to unfold, shaped by the shadow of that fateful day but no longer consumed by it. Each had found a way to carve out something resembling peace, though it came in forms none of them had anticipated. Daniel eventually moved to a different state, settling in a small town by the mountains. He became a craftsman, known for restoring antique furniture with meticulous care. His shop was unassuming, tucked into a quiet street where regulars often stopped by for a chat. To those who met him, Daniel was a man of few words, someone who had clearly lived through storms but preferred not to talk about them. In his quiet moments, Daniel still thought about Grace and Liam. He didn't dwell on the pain as he once had, but he couldn't escape the ripple effects of their choices. He avoided weddings and large gatherings, content to live a life of solitude. Yet, there was a quiet strength in his solitude, a resilience that spoke of a man who had learned to endure. One spring morning, Daniel received an unexpected visitor. A boy, no older than 10, wandered into his shop, eyes wide as he admired the polished wood and intricate carvings. Behind him, a woman stepped in. Her hair was streaked with gray, but her posture was confident, her expression soft. It was Grace. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He glanced at the boy, who had picked up a small wooden figurine. "He yours?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but low. Grace nodded. "My nephew. I've been raising him since my sister passed." Daniel's gaze softened. He had imagined many scenarios where they might cross paths again, but this was not one of them. He gestured for her to sit at the small table near the shop's window. They talked in halting sentences at first, catching up on years that had slipped away. Grace spoke of her bookstore, her nephew, and the quiet life she had built. She didn't mention Liam, but Daniel noticed the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the table when his name hovered unspoken between them. "You seem better," Grace said cautiously. Daniel nodded. "I've had time to make peace with things. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's better." Grace hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was an old picture of the three of them, Daniel, Grace, and Liam, taken at a holiday party long before everything fell apart. "I found this a while ago," she said, sliding it across the table. "Thought you might want it." Daniel stared at the photo for a long time. He remembered that night vividly. The laughter, the warmth, the feeling that they were invincible. It was a cruel irony, how fleeting those moments had been. "Thank you," he said quietly, slipping the photo into his pocket. Grace didn't stay long. When she and her nephew left, Daniel watched them disappear down the street, a bittersweet pang in his chest. He wasn't sure if he would ever see her again, but he was strangely okay with that. Their conversation had felt like a chapter closing, not with dramatic finality, but with quiet understanding. Anna, meanwhile, had built a life that felt purposeful. Her work as a social worker brought her face to face with stories of pain, betrayal, and healing every day. She carried Liam's memory with her, not as a burden, but as a guide, a reminder to approach even the most broken people with compassion. On what would have been Liam's 50th birthday, she visited his grave. The headstone was simple, etched with his name and the dates that marked his short life. She placed a single white rose at its base. "I still wonder who you would have been," she said softly, her voice carried by the wind. "But I hope, wherever you are, you've found peace." Daniel never fully escaped the memories of Liam or the choices that had led to his death. But he found solace in his work, in the small community he had built around him. Grace, too, carried her regrets, but she channeled them into raising her nephew with kindness and care, determined to teach him the value of honesty and forgiveness. In the end, the tragedy that had bound their lives together also served as a reminder of their humanity, their capacity to hurt, to love, and to endure. The scars would always remain, but so would the lessons. And so, their stories continued, intertwined not by what could have been, but by what was, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the aftermath of devastation. Years later, in the autumn of their lives, the threads of their separate journeys converged one last time. It wasn't planned, nor was it dramatic, just a quiet, serendipitous moment that offered closure none of them had sought, but all secretly needed. Daniel was attending a small crafts fair in the city, showcasing his handmade furniture and figurines. His booth was modest, tucked in the corner, surrounded by the hum of cheerful chatter and the scent of roasted chestnuts. He had become known for his craftsmanship, his hands creating beauty from wood, as though it were his way of repairing what couldn't be fixed in life. Across the fair, Grace strolled with her nephew, now a young man studying art in college. They had grown close over the years, their bond a source of light in the aftermath of darkness. She hadn't expected to see Daniel, but when her eyes landed on him, she froze. His hair was streaked with gray, his posture still strong but softened by time. There was something peaceful about him, a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. Her nephew noticed her hesitation. "A friend of yours?" he asked. Grace hesitated, then nodded. "An old friend." Daniel spotted her before she could decide whether to approach. For a moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Grace took a deep breath, mustered a smile, and walked toward his booth. "Your work is beautiful," she said, her voice steady, though her heart fluttered. "Thank you," Daniel replied, his tone warm but measured. "It's good to see you." They stood in silence for a moment, the years between them heavy yet oddly comforting. Grace's nephew wandered off to explore, giving them space. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," Grace admitted, her fingers brushing the edge of a polished wooden box on his table. "Life's funny that way," Daniel said. "Sometimes it gives you what you didn't know you needed." They talked for a while, catching up on the surface details of their lives. Grace spoke of her nephew, her bookstore, and the small joys she had found in her quiet world. Daniel shared stories of his work, his simple life in the mountains, and the peace he'd found in the rhythm of creation. As they spoke, the years of pain, anger, and regret seemed to fade into the background. They weren't the same people who had once loved, betrayed, and hurt each other. They were older, wiser, and more accepting of the imperfect, messy reality of life. Before they parted, Grace reached into her bag and handed Daniel a small, wrapped parcel. "For you," she said softly. Daniel unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the pages blank but the cover embossed with a simple design of intertwined branches. "I thought you might like to fill it," she said, "with whatever you want." Daniel ran his fingers over the cover, his throat tightening. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect." Grace smiled, and for the first time in years, it felt genuine and unburdened. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." "You too," he replied. "And thank you for everything." They parted ways, the moment brief but significant. Neither of them looked back as they walked away, but both carried the weight of the encounter like a soft glow, a quiet reassurance that the wounds of the past no longer defined them. In the years that followed, they didn't meet again. But Daniel wrote in the journal often, filling its pages with memories, reflections, and even sketches of the life he had built. Grace continued to pour her energy into her bookstore, finding comfort in the stories she shared with others. And Anna, still a fierce advocate for those in need, often thought of that day at the grave and the strength it had given her to live a life of purpose. Their lives, once shattered, had been rebuilt, not as they had imagined, but in ways that allowed them to move forward. The tragedy of the past was a part of them, but it no longer defined them. In the end, their story wasn't one of perfection or redemption, but of resilience, a testament to the human capacity to endure, to grow, and to find peace, even in the shadow of loss. As time marched on, they became living proof that while scars may never fade, they can transform into something beautiful. Reminders of survival, strength, and the fragile, enduring hope that life always offers another chance.